Konnichiwa. Good afternoon. I'm very honored to be able to facilitate this extremely important session on a common threat, an existential threat that we are all facing. And when I think about climate change, as a Japanese living in New Zealand, and every time I return to Tokyo, I'm a bit astounded, by the changes that we are facing, especially with the extreme weather events, the sudden, intensifying rainfall that we're experiencing even in the cities, and also that causing urban flash floods. And also, what was really shocking for me this time when I returned to Japan was the number of bear attacks, that were taking place in all parts of Japan. And it is, of course, the causal factors are probably complex, but one of the causes is the warmer winters in Japan. And it's very difficult for bears to hibernate. So hungry bears would, go to the residential areas, which never happened before, and attack, especially the elderly. And another shocking, incident was extreme heat, and that affecting, Japan's energy security and really affecting the most vulnerable in the society, particularly the elderly people, who die from extreme heat. So, sorry, I just painted a very gloomy picture, but I hope that this will be a great opportunity to learn about the actual consequences of climate change from different perspectives. And I'm extremely privileged to introduce you to our two speakers, Janani Vivekananda on my right side. She is the Senior Research Fellow for Toda Peace Institute's program on climate change and conflict. She's also the head of program on climate diplomacy and security at Adelphi in Berlin, Germany. And she is a specialist on climate change and peace building. As a peace building practitioner, with a background in peace and disaster risk reduction, field research, and operations, she hopes that her work connects realities on the ground with the policy processes. And next, I would like to introduce Carol Farbotko, who has flown from Australia to join us in Tokyo. She is a principal researcher of Toda Peace Institute's project on climate change in the Pacific. Carol is a cultural geographer with an interest in peace building. And her research focuses on climate mobilities and immobilities, particularly in the Pacific region. And her important work has been quite influential in understanding the cultural and political impacts of both climate-related displacement and its solutions. So, first of all, since Toda Peace Institute is a peace research institute, it's very important that we understand how climate change is associated with peace. I'm sure that many people in our Japanese audience don't really see the close link between climate change, security, and peace. So I would like to take this opportunity to ask Janani first about how does climate change become a barrier, a hurdle to peace building, and how does climate change fuel insecurity?
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ria, for the introduction, and it's such an honor to be here again. I was honored last year to have my first experience at one of these seminars, so it's really wonderful to be back in this space. What do we think about when we think about climate change? I think a lot of people will think about some of these impacts you talked about, the heat waves, sea level rise, extreme weather events. We might think about melting ice caps and polar bears. We might think about bears. I actually had never heard of bears coming into cities as an impact of climate change, but being from Sri Lanka, we have the same thing with elephants. But I want to say that actually when we think about climate change in the context of peace, I really want us to think about it in a slightly different way. Yes, it is about all of these things, but it's also about people. And it's thus really, really central to peace. What do I mean by this? I mean that, just as you say, climate change is a barrier to peace. It makes it much harder to reach peace in a place that's fragile or affected by conflict. And when you do get there, it makes that very fragile peace much harder to sustain, because climate itself, through all these impacts that we probably know and understand quite well, through extreme and unpredictable rainfall, through extreme heat events, through more and more hot days and cyclones, these impacts, they affect the core foundations of what we need to sustain peaceful lives and livelihoods. In a landmark study that Japan was part of as part of the G7, commissioned by the G7 in 2015, called A New Climate for Peace, we set out 7 key pathways, quite compound ways in which climate change interacts with existing socio-economic vulnerabilities to really have a knock-on impact on peace and security. So I think it's really important to understand this not as a direct link, like a direct causal kind of golden thread through which climate change leads to conflict, but rather through a kind of a series of chain events. It can affect food security, it can affect water security, livelihoods, the core things that people need to sustain their livelihoods. So I think it's very helpful to think of it as a chain. We have these impacts, we've got droughts, flooding, sea level rise. This puts pressure on resources, on livelihoods. This heightens grievances. And in places where you have good grievance dispute resolution mechanisms, it's okay. These can be resolved. But in places where there are not efficient governance mechanisms or institutions to address these without violence, then these heightened grievances can erode trust in governance, in the institutions. It can erode cooperation across different groups. And that is where there's an increased risk of conflict or social unrest. Because peace breaks down where people lose confidence in the institutions and governance structures that they have. And climate puts such an increased pressure on those mechanisms. So it's a kind of compounding factor. So I think I want to just leave you with this idea that climate is about people. It's not just about environmental issues. And so to understand what to do about this, because it's not just this gloomy picture, there are so many entry points that climate change offers for peace building. But for us to get to that, we must look beyond the physical hazards and really understand the critical mediating factors through which climate poses these challenges. And these are governance, social cohesion, and trust, inequality, and marginalization. So if we understand the role that these parts play, they also offer the solutions through which we can address some of these risks.
Yes, thank you, Janani. So I think a lot of research has been conducted in the past, to see the direct connection between climate change and conflict, or climate change and war. Although, data shows that there is no direct, causal relationship, all these research have revealed that climate change is a threat multiplier. So in a very, fragile society, like Janani just mentioned, climate change can increase that threat. So now I would like to move on to Carol, who has done a lot of research on how climate change can become an existential threat for the Pacific Island nations. And this threat is quite multifaceted. But I think it's very important to learn, from her case studies, because it's very difficult for us to imagine, what that is like. What is it like to be forced to relocate? And so, Carol has done a lot of work on climate change, mobility, and the consequences of that. So, Carol, could you share about your case study in the Pacific?
Yes. Just picking up on Janani's point about climate change being about people. In the Pacific, they're often Pacific people and Pacific communities and even Pacific nation states are considered among the most vulnerable to climate change, partly because of the low-lying nature and coastal nature of a lot of Pacific Island communities. And so the existential risk to them means, entire villages and in some cases entire islands or even entire nations facing this risk that sea level rise compounded with other climate impacts such as extreme weather events and coastal erosion and impacts on food and water security may make these places uninhabitable. And to really understand, I guess, the incredibly major losses that people in the Pacific are facing, it's not just about, economic loss, or loss of infrastructure or, things that can be addressed through kind of financial and technological solutions. So in the Pacific, the people, many communities are Indigenous and have very strong connections to the land and the sea territory that they have lived on for, in some cases, thousands of years. So having that kind of possible future, facing that existential risk in the future that my community and my children and, our entire kind of culture is at risk. Where will we go and how will we kind of address this risk has been in the Pacific for a very long time, something that communities are facing. And of course, there's this climate justice argument that the Pacific Islands with very low levels of industry and very small populations have contributed almost nothing to the global climate change problem and yet are facing some of its biggest impacts. So there's that kind of moral question of what the international community is kind of like, what should be done by the international community to kind of address some of these problems.
So today I'd like to focus as much as possible on case studies because it helps us imagine what people go through in the real world. So next I would like to ask Janani to explain, how are these threats actually affecting the people in the Middle East and particularly in Syria?
Thanks, Ria. This is great to draw on because it's very, very fresh in my mind. I was just in Syria 2 weeks ago, and this is a context where there is a very, very fragile peace. And what's interesting here is that Syria was one of the first examples where a lot of this research on this golden thread linking climate and conflict was being developed. And I'm not going to say that this was a conflict that was caused by climate change. Absolutely not. This was a conflict caused by years, decades of repressive governance. However, what triggered the conflict was in part, multiple years of drought affecting the livelihoods of rural farmers, which just put that additional catalytic pressure on this oppressive government kind of regime, and meant that it just tipped over that threshold of what people were able to cope with. So this is a conflict that has some roots in climate stress. And yet now when you have, I don't know how much of the context of the war and the kind of this very, very nascent peace process you're familiar with in Syria, but you will not hear a single word about climate change because the entire narrative is about stabilizing, addressing ISIS, addressing the very, very volatile situation across different sectarian groups who are vying for kind of power and ability to maintain their space within a new political administration. But if you understand the need to build peace as being rooted in addressing the root causes of a conflict, the understanding the drivers of what people experienced that kind of led to these grievances and the destabilization, that does mean we really do need to be understanding these climate dimensions. So when I was in Syria, it was alarming, because this is also a context where this is the national narrative as well. There is huge water stress. Syria is still facing, as it was 14 years ago at the start of the conflict, increased numbers of hot days, strains on agricultural livelihoods. And yet, right now, there's a very, very challenging moment for the national government to both bring stability to the country, to start doing things very quickly to improve the conditions of people's lives. And this means rebuilding, kind of reconstruction, building roads, kind of creating something that's very visible and tangible so people feel confidence and legitimacy in this new government. But then they also need to be addressing the climate dimension, because this is the long-term point of how to ensure this is sustainable. And I think this is something that Keith mentioned in his point, and I really like this. It's this short-term versus medium to long-term challenge. And here, it's often, we're in this political space now, where the urgent trumps the important, and and climate gives you this reminder that if you don't address the important, which is ensuring that reconstruction in Syria takes account of the fact that there's just not going to be groundwater. If you rebuild this village here as it was then, you will be in the same problem 3 years down the line, because there's not enough groundwater for people to farm. And if you have these young people coming up, not able to farm and not able to find a livelihood, then exactly the same loop can perpetuate. What did people do when they couldn't find livelihoods? They were very easily recruited into armed groups, because it wasn't ideological predominantly, it was economic decision making that kind of fueled the armed groups that were part of the conflict in Syria. So I think this is both a kind of a cautionary tale, but also an opportunity. So when I was there, you see a lot of the investment in reconstruction in Syria being supported by Japan, and JICA is doing some really impressive work. And I think these are the kind of opportunities, these windows for engaging in, if we can integrate climate considerations into reconstruction, into development interventions, even into humanitarian assistance. This is a really positive space for kind of having a double dividend to kind of promote climate resilience as well as resilience to conflict, because those root causes are the same. The root causes and those vulnerabilities that make people vulnerable to climate risks are the same things that made people vulnerable to conflict.
So when it comes to climate mobility, one topic that, Carol briefly mentioned earlier, but is a very important one for the Pacific Islanders, is the consequence of intangible losses and damages that come from climate-induced migration, relocation, displacement. So I want everybody to sort of like use your imagination. Japan is an island, and let's say we start to sink, in the future, and we are told that we have to migrate to China. As a community, we have to migrate to China. How would the Japanese people feel, in terms of losing their land, losing their identity, losing their culture, losing their tradition? So please imagine how detrimental that would be for us. And from that standpoint, I'd like to ask Carol to share the experiences of the fellow Tuvaluans.
Thank you. Yes, so a lot of my research is in the very small island state of Tuvalu, which is all very low-lying atoll islands, very at risk of long-term sea level rise problems. And so there has been a lot of debate about if Tuvaluans will need to move elsewhere, and if so, where would they go? And Tuvaluan people are doing their best to reclaim the solution space of that debate. So a lot of it has been driven by external ideas of what Tuvaluans might need or what might happen in the future. But I think, we've talked a little bit about hope. If we can see in the Pacific, people have been facing this existential risk, for 20, 30 years. Children have grown up knowing nothing but my island might be about to become uninhabitable. And yet we're not seeing, conflict directly related to extreme weather or other climate impacts. And what we are seeing is actually quite a lot of leadership from very small island governments. This Tuvalu only has 11,000 people, so you can imagine how small the government's resources are to address this problem. Partly it's about building good international partnerships, which are extremely important, but it's also about coming up with solutions themselves that they own and that are culturally appropriate and that address some of these intangible losses that people are facing. And part of the solution is, if we do have to move, are we in charge of where we're going? Are we in charge of, our future and, writing our own history on this? And we're actually seeing that. So, in the face of this existential risk, people with very limited financial resources are coming up with their own solutions to the best of their capacity in terms of what they can actually afford. So, there's examples like the Tuvalu Digital Nation. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but Tuvalu has decided that one of their approaches to climate risk is to build a digital Tuvalu. So everything will be online, their cultural heritage, their government, just in case that's what's needed so that they can maintain their statehood and their sovereignty. But another very important part of Tuvalu's climate risk strategy is to protect the islands and not so that people don't have to move. And the technology is there. That's more good news. What's needed is more financial assistance because it's very expensive to build reclaimed land to the standards that climate change projections into the future require. But it has started in Tuvalu, and it is giving people hope.
Great. We're running out of time, so this will be the last question for our session. And I would like to focus on Japan's role. Japan, as you know, has played an extremely leading role in providing ODA to Pacific Island nations so that they could help the Pacific Island nations to bolster their climate resilience. Japan has a lot of experience and knowledge regarding disaster risk reduction. They have given a lot of support to the Pacific region to augment and strengthen the infrastructure, like coastal monitoring, provided technical cooperation, so on and so forth. But first, I'd like to ask Carol, what would you like the Japanese to be aware of as donors, as a country that is trying to support the Pacific Island nations to become more resilient in the face of climate-induced risks?
So really to listen to what the leadership in these small threatened places is saying. So there is good leadership there. There is good policies in these nation states that are, very clear about what the populations need and what they want. So the best thing to do is to really get to know that context, get to know what the governments and the civil society, the activists are all saying about, and it's all very aligned. We want to stay put, we want to stay where we are, and only in the very worst case scenario do we want to move. So that's a very clear message that support for in situ adaptation, we call it, the type of work in place that can help people stay where they are in the face of extreme sea level rise, which, like I said before, is technically possible in many cases. It just needs good financial assistance. But obviously it's very complicated, when you make new land, who's going to live there and how is it going to interact with existing Indigenous rights to land? And it's very complicated. So it needs to be done really well, and it needs to be done in line with, existing Indigenous governance, existing national laws, all those kind of issues in very deep consultation with the people. But it can be done, with good partnerships.
So listening and learning from the people is extremely important. So lastly, I would like to ask Janani, do you think Japan can play a leading role, in the Asia-Pacific region, in maybe like strengthening regional cooperation amongst the countries?
Thanks, Ria. Yes, I think I'll very quickly say what I think Japan, I think yes, it can, absolutely. But what Japan shouldn't do is militarized responses, because this is, we see this happening in so many contexts, diverting resources from climate action, from humanitarian and disaster risk reduction, from these really important spaces which really build that adaptive capacity. And, if this is diverted into military spending, we see, that there's a taking away over here to fund this over here. Securitizing like some of these key challenges like migration. Again, we see this, seeing this as a problem to be managed rather than a positive adaptive strategy like Carol was speaking about. So really to understand and listen rather than see this as a problem, which needs to be dealt with walls and barriers. And also, and this might be a little surprising to hear, but to really avoid technical fixes, because like I said, climate can be understood as a hydrometeorological issue, or it can be understood as a people-centered issue. And Japan has this long tradition of really putting human security at the center of foreign policy and development policy. And so I think its leading role can be really to ensure that human security and people-centered approaches to climate change stay central. And how can they do this? I think you touched on this kind of, one is through advocacy, through Japan's participation in a number of multilateral spaces. I don't share my Toda colleagues' optimism about a reformed UN system. I think the future of multilateralism, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, is going to be regional. And I think there Japan really has a great amount of power as a middle power, and as quite a strong middle power in this region. So through things like APEC and ASEAN, through the G7, through the G20, but to really use these platforms as a space for advocating for kind of human-centered climate action. The other is very, very practical through doing climate security risk assessments to understand in very context-specific ways how climate has these implications on peace and security, and using those assessments to inform foreign policy and development strategies. The third is very simple. It's integrating that knowledge into programming through financing, through what JICA is doing, or through kind of development and even defense strategies. And the final one is action, just to ensure that all this great knowledge that Japan has on disaster risk reduction is expanded into, financing for early warning and early action, not just in DRR, but also in climate, and also into anticipatory action, because as a country, Japan really does have a leadership role, because has been one of the few countries that are able to fund kind of prevention rather than response. And I think this is such a great space and a really important leadership role that Japan can play.
Thank you so much. I think the important insight that we learned from these two very outstanding experts, well, for me, is we have to make sure that climate change is not securitized. In other words, let's not try to deal with the threats of climate change by increasing our military spending. And Carol, would you like to say a few words to end this session? Any request?
Yeah, I mean, the last thing that the Pacific Islands need is militarization. But that's, I guess, something that is in the back of people's minds in the Pacific that, they're well, at least I guess until a year or two ago when other security issues became more prominent, that the geopolitical space of the Pacific was extremely important background to the way, bigger countries interacted in the Pacific. And I still think that's an issue, particularly, there's US military bases in the Northern Pacific, and Australia's taking it's more of a soft kind of approach, but, there's an very large increase in Australian presence in the Pacific, partly for climate reasons, but partly for other reasons. So, yeah, there's that background does need to inform, the thinking about climate. Even on the ground climate adaptation projects, they're all to some extent involved in this geopolitical kind of background. So, yeah, that's something to keep in mind.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Janani. With this, we will conclude.